renewal away from eviction. And this would put the law back to where it was before 2003.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to lump the next two together because they're similar, although there's obviously a nuance. And the permanent MCI increase and the permanent individual apartment increase.
Yeah, these are, especially the MCI is probably the most difficult issue we're dealing with. And we have bills that will eliminate them entirely, meaning no more rent increases for building-wide improvements and no more increases for individual apartment improvements. One of the problems with this is that as a public policy matter, one of the arguments in favor of rent control as a policy is that it gives landlords a mechanism for improving their apartments. But we're trying to make legislators understand, and I think many of them do understand, how landlords have weaponized this program to basically price people out of their homes. A very typical scenario is that people put up with lousy conditions for 20 years, 30 years. The landlord doesn't maintain the building, certainly doesn't invest in the building. If they do anything, they just patch. And then the building gets sold to a speculator, and they immediately come in and start replacing windows, replacing elevators, replacing roofs, whatever, new wiring, and they slam people with multiple MCI rent increase applications at a time. We have tenants in Queens and the Bronx who are literally facing rent increases of $500 a month from MCIs. And now granted, those are phased in over time because there's an annual cap on collectability, which for rent stabilization is 6% per year. But eventually they're going to be priced out and they'll have to move. And this is why tenants are up in arms about this.
And then we have eliminate the statute of limitations on rent overcharges.
Yeah, one of the things Shelley Silver did the landlords a big favor with in 1997 was to agree to limit the ability to look back to determine what the legal rent is to 4 years before a tenant files an overcharge complaint, which has made it much easier for landlords to illegally deregulate apartments, and it's made it much easier for landlords to overcharge tenants. So we have a bill that would end that and would allow a look back as far as necessary to determine the legal rent, and would allow tenants, instead of 4 years to file an overcharge complaint, 6 years. Because there's always been a cap on collectability of rent overcharges. That's been in the law since 1983. But originally there was not a cap on how far you could look back. And this has been a really bad situation. So our bill would correct that.
Mm-hmm. And then the last one, actually, you could help my mother. Rent control. My 90-year-old mom. Rent control, rent stabilization parity.
Well, rent control tenants get hit with annual rent increases of 7.5%. Plus, they get a fuel pass-along, which is a dollar amount per room, which varies from year to year depending on fuel prices. And it's just not fair because most rent control tenants are, well, almost all of them are elderly and most of them are low income. They have, the data show that rent control tenants have incomes significantly lower than rent stabilized tenants. The average age of a head of household of a rent controlled apartment is 71. The average age under rent stabilization is something like, I'm trying to remember, like 47. And it's just, it's terrible. People get slammed with these huge rent increases and they can't afford them.
Yeah, no.
And it literally is the kind of thing of, choosing to pay the rent or paying for your medication.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank God that's not my mother's dilemma, but still, those increases.
Yeah, well, a lot of rent control tenants are in exactly that boat.
No, I know.
This would provide them with relief by making their rent increases parallel, essentially, to rent stabilized rent increases, which are much lower
as
a rule.
Yeah, no, I know elderly rent control tenants who gave up their rent control status, took smaller apartments in their buildings because they didn't need the space they had anymore. I guess the family grown up, moved out, and landlords had given them their rent controlled rent for a rent stabilized apartment that was smaller as an incentive to make them a small apartment. So this way they can manage the smaller rent increases. I mean, it's there's just no logic to the disparity in the increases anymore. So those are the 9 bills. So that's what we're fighting for, obviously. And I guess, well, it's funny, we didn't mention. I assume in Meshton these is renewing the rent stabilization.
Oh, there's no question. There's absolutely no question that the laws are going to be renewed.
Right.
There's zero chance that they won't be renewed.
Right. So the dynamic here is, as you were laying out, so we have the very, collaborative pro-tenant Senate, the pro-tenant assembly, less collaborative, more of a top-down thing, and then we have a governor who is, been very much the friend of the real estate industry, but who the classic Andrew Cuomo move would be to, have some nice, improvements. If you like, he's always touted that he raised the vacancy allowance and the vacancy decontrol limit, on high rent and that stuff. The classic Andrew Cuomo would be to have some improvements, but not the improvements we need that would really help secure the system. Because we have to turn back the tide on like 20 to 40 years worth of erosion here. So I guess my question is, are there things, now, on one hand, you would say, well, why wouldn't the Senate and the Assembly just do a 2-house bill and put it forward?
Well, there are institutional rivalries between the 2 houses, and the mere fact that the Democrats now control both houses doesn't simply eliminate that tension between the 2 houses. It's often a question of who gets credit, who originates what, and it's just, some of it's like, kindergarten, if you know what I mean. But that's what we're dealing with. And you're dealing with personalities. I mean, legislators are humans, and they're like every other human being. They have quirks and foibles, and you have to be aware of all of this.
Yeah, it's funny. I'd say that the kindergarten analogy, being the father of a student in pre-K, I actually think she's more mature than many of the legislators in all way.
I'm sure she is, having met her.
So, I think it's more nursery school, maybe, not pre-kindergarten.
Right.
But I guess now, the other thing is, I wonder in the dynamic here, now obviously rent is the big thing still hanging out here, but there are other things they want to get done before the end of the session. And I'm wondering is, like, they always talk about the big ugly, where everything gets glommed together into, like, one massive bill dealing with everything from rent regulation to, like, speed cameras, for example, whatever, anything you can throw in the soup.
Certainly that's Andrew Cuomo's hope.
Right, so the thing is now...
There will be a big ugly, because that gives him a lot of leverage.
Exactly. So, I mean, are there things out there that we know the Assembly or the Senate wants that the governor will dangle, that,
Well, there's a whole bunch of remaining issues, that, some want, some don't want. There's marijuana legalization. There's driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants. There's sexual harassment guidelines, which everyone agrees need to be updated. One thing Cuomo is going to dangle in front of the legislature is capital funding and member item funding, because there was no capital funding in the state budget that was adopted in March and April, and he said we'll deal with that later. So he's obviously going to say to legislators, in fact he's already saying, that if you want capital funding and if you want member item funding for your district, like little league teams and things like that, you'll have to deal with me. And I think, for many legislators, this is a very big issue and it's a temptation. But I can tell you unofficially that the Senate Democrats have taken a position that they're not going to sell their principles for money. And they have been told internally, and they've agreed to this, that they're not going to agree to water down the rent package in return for any capital money or any member item funding. And I don't think they will have any difficulty if that's the way this plays out. I don't think they'll have any difficulty convincing their constituents who the Grinch was who stole the money for the little league teams. But I mean, this is Planet Albany, and things change by the minute, and nothing is predictable.
And wasn't there a point last week where the governor said he was not involved in the three-way negotiations, and then towards the end of the week, did I hear correctly that he
Right.
is involved in the three-way negotiations on rent? I mean, so
He's terrified that the Assembly and the Senate might reach a deal on rent without him, and that he will then have to sign it. And while I think he's concerned about the content, I think he's more concerned about being in control.
oh, of course, that's him.
And that's who he is.
Yeah, exactly.
And he's doing all sorts of crazy things to sow division within the Senate Democratic Conference. His state party chairman, Jay Jacobs, who's the chair of the New York State Democratic Party, called all 6 Democratic senators from Long Island and told them not to vote for these rent bills. Now, do you think Jay Jacobs did that without Andrew Cuomo's knowledge, or without Andrew saying okay? I don't think so.
No, of course not.
I mean, not with this governor. He's the original control freak.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been told that Andrew himself has made calls to senators trying to get them to say they will not vote for these bills.
Now, do we know, are there any bills in particular that he has a problem with? Is it the MCI bills? Because I understand that even him and the mayor, I believe, have problems with the MCI.
Yes, both Bill DeBlasio and Andrew Cuomo have said that we can't just end MCIs and IAIs. We have to have some program where landlords can improve their buildings, and so we should reform it, not eliminate it. That's one thing. As far as we know, he's opposed to good cause eviction, and as far as we know, despite his saying that he thinks that municipalities across the state should have the right to opt into the rent regulation system, we're not sure he actually means that. We're not sure he means anything.
Right.
Because he's been very vague about what he will or will not support.
And has the mayor explained why the MCI thing is something his issue with? Because I'm sure as a councilman he wouldn't have had issue with it. Maybe he's polled how this plays in Iowa. I have no idea. But
I don't know. Maybe these Iowa voters are telling him you can't get rid of MCIs.
yeah, it's just, why he took that stand, I don't understand. The mayor.
Well, who can understand anything Bill de Blasio does at this point?
So now, obviously, we've been talking a lot about the policy, the inside game here. It all boiled down, obviously, Saturday. But obviously, there's a lot of action still going on. There was a lot of action last week. I understand you, in a storied career of activism, couldn't get yourself arrested last week. I mean,
Oh my God, it was amazing. I mean, we had 100 people ready to get arrested, and I think they arrested 61 finally. And we were outside. I was outside with a bunch of people, including a bunch of Met Council members, in front of the governor's office.